Cherry and Jonathan boarded the same flight to London, and the moment Cherry laid eyes on him, a surge of contempt and fear twisted her features. She recoiled, her nose lifting in disgust, and loudly announced to the cabin, "I refuse to sit near him. It's unsafe, I feel threatened." Her words cut through the air like knives, each syllable a public humiliation aimed at Jonathan. He sat there, headphones on, music filling his ears, his heart tightening with anger and indignation, but he didn't respond. He let her venomous words hang in the air, powerless to touch his calm, while she soaked in the cruel satisfaction of her own superiority. 10 minutes later, the captain's voice trembled over the intercom. "Is there a pilot on board?" Jonathan rose slowly, eyes calm but fierce, and said, "Yes, I am a pilot." Cherry froze, her face drained of color, her mouth agape, paralyzed by shock and disbelief. She hadn't even considered that the man she spat on with her words could wield real power that would turn her arrogance and cruelty back on her. What came next would leave her reeling, humiliated in ways she had never imagined. But before we dive into what happens, take a moment to subscribe to the channel. Now let's uncover how this story truly began. The first-class cabin gleamed under the soft amber lighting, each seat a cocoon of luxury draped in buttery leather and polished wood. Champagne glasses sparkled as if capturing fragments of sunlight trapped in crystal. Cherry adjusted her designer scarf, the silk brushing lightly against her neck, and raised her glass to her lips. Her eyes, sharp and calculating, scanned the cabin with a sense of ownership, as though every passenger and steward owed her silent acknowledgement of her social superiority. The hum of conversation and the muted click of seatbelts provided a comfortable background, a cocoon of familiarity she had always commanded in her life. She inhaled the subtle scent of expensive cologne mingling with the faint leather aroma of the seats, feeling perfectly in control, until the man took the seat next to her. Jonathan sat down with the quiet grace of someone accustomed to being unnoticed yet present in every moment. His black pilot's uniform was neatly pressed, his dark skin luminous under the cabin lights. His movements were precise, deliberate, yet unassuming, a testament to years of discipline in an unforgiving profession. He adjusted his headphones, the soft whisper of jazz filling his ears, his eyes briefly scanning the aisle with the calm awareness of a man who understood both the fragility and strength of human life. A subtle warmth of dignity radiated from him, a quiet assurance that needed no validation. When he glanced at Cherry, he offered a polite nod and a smile that could have diffused tension in any room, though the effect it had on her was the opposite. Cherry stiffened, a reflexive tightening of her jaw and narrowing of her eyes. She waved a flight attendant over with the sharp precision of someone accustomed to compliance, her voice rising above the gentle hum of the cabin. "I refuse to sit next to him. It's unsafe. I feel threatened." Her words were clipped, deliberate, designed to project both fear and authority, and the faint tremor in her voice betrayed the thin veil over a deeper insecurity. The passengers nearest to her glanced up, some with curiosity, others with discomfort, while Jonathan remained still, absorbing the insult as one might absorb a physical blow without flinching. Though the quiet heat of anger began to stir in his chest, he felt a pang of humiliation, the bitter sting of someone questioning his worth based solely on the color of his skin. His hands tightened briefly on the armrests, a subtle manifestation of the tension he chose not to vocalize. He remembered his father's calm voice echoing from childhood, "Dignity is a quiet strength." And so he allowed her words to exist in the space between them, choosing silence over confrontation, letting her prejudice echo into a void she did not understand. His eyes, dark and unwavering, watched her as she fumed, each tick of her designer watched a small drumbeat of impatience and entitlement. The minutes passed like slow-motion waves. Jonathan's mind was anchored in the present, yet his senses were alert to every detail, the shimmer of her earrings, the sharp scent of her perfume, the faint tremble in her voice as she continued to demand attention from the flight attendants. 10 minutes after takeoff, a panicked voice crackled through the intercom, piercing the cocoon of false calm. "Is there a pilot on board? Please, this is an emergency." The cabin fell into a hush, a tension so thick it was almost tactile. Hearts raced, hands tightened around armrests, eyes darted toward the cockpit door. Jonathan unbuckled his seatbelt with deliberate calm, the faint creak of the leather sounding impossibly loud to the passengers who watched, frozen between fear and hope. He stood, tall and composed, a figure of authority that required no announcement, only presence. The eyes of the cabin followed him, and for a brief moment, Cherry's arrogance faltered. Her lips parted, ready to speak, but no sound emerged. He looked at her, his expression steady, imbued with a quiet authority that demanded recognition. "Yes, I am a pilot," he said, his voice calm yet resonant, carrying an unmistakable weight of experience and control. Every syllable seemed to echo in the cabin, grounding the fear, centering the chaos. Cherry froze, her breath catching in her throat, her carefully maintained composure cracking under the sudden reversal of perceived power. She looked around, hoping for some ally in the cabin, but the judgmental stares of other passengers met her gaze instead, reflecting a mixture of admiration for Jonathan and silent reproach for her earlier arrogance. Jonathan did not wait for her apology, nor did he acknowledge the humiliation he had absorbed. He turned and walked past her toward the cockpit door, each step purposeful, measured, a physical manifestation of his inner calm and moral fortitude. The soft rustle of his uniform and the quiet determination in his stride seemed almost ritualistic, a signal to the cabin that order had returned and that fear would be met with skill and courage. As the cockpit door closed behind him, Cherry's mind raced. The veneer of control she had maintained for her entire life now seemed fragile, brittle, and meaningless in the face of true expertise. She realized in a flash of uncomfortable clarity that her social standing, her wealth, and her carefully curated image were powerless in this space where skill, courage, and dignity defined authority. Her chest tightened, a mix of anger, fear, and unspoken recognition of her own inadequacy, and she sank slightly into her seat, the champagne glass trembling in her hand. She wanted to speak, to demand respect, to reclaim some fragment of dominance, but the words caught in her throat. She understood, in a visceral way, that this man, this quiet, composed, utterly competent man, was now the axis around which her reality had shifted. Jonathan's figure disappeared into the cockpit, but the echo of his presence lingered, a reminder of the quiet strength that existed beyond prejudice, beyond fear, beyond the fragile hierarchies Cherry had relied on her entire life. The cabin remained hushed, the tension palpable, but there was an unspoken shift, a subtle realignment of values as passengers. Processed the juxtaposition between arrogance and genuine capability, between fear and steadfastness, between vanity and courage. Cherry's face, once smug and untouchable, now reflected a cocktail of emotions: terror, humiliation, awe, and the faint glimmer of understanding that the world did not owe her validation. In that moment, the scene was not just a confrontation of social status or racial bias. It was an intimate tableau of human fragility and strength, a quiet prelude to the extraordinary events that would unfold. Cherry's rigid posture softened imperceptibly, her eyes flicking toward the cockpit, toward the man who had simultaneously humiliated her and shielded everyone from catastrophe. And Jonathan, alone behind the door, centered himself for the challenge ahead, embodying a grace and courage born not from pride, but from a deep, unwavering respect for life itself. Jonathan pushed open the cockpit door, and the first thing that hit him was the raw chaos. The cabin's calm detachment was gone. It had been replaced by a maelstrom of alarms, blinking lights, and the metallic scent of stress lingering in the recycled air. The co-pilot's body slumped forward, his head resting heavily against the instrument panel, a stark, terrifying contrast to the disciplined environment Jonathan had trained to command. A sheen of sweat covered Captain Miller's pale face as his knuckles whitened around the yoke. His breaths shallow, ragged, and desperate. The violent turbulence tossed the aircraft like a toy in the hands of an indifferent child, rattling the instruments, the panels, and the fragile nerves of anyone within earshot. Jonathan's eyes took in every detail in a fraction of a second. The cockpit, usually a sanctuary of precision and routine, had become a theater of human fragility. The co-pilot's stillness screamed medical emergency, while the captain's trembling body betrayed both the physical strain and the fear of failing hundreds of lives at once. Time seemed to slow. The roar of the engines and the shrill alarms blended into a single, disorienting symphony. Jonathan's heartbeat matched the rhythm of the plane's shuddering, but rather than succumb, he breathed in and let the calm wash over him, centering himself. "I'm Jonathan, commercial certified," he said, his voice calm but edged with a steel that immediately commanded attention. He slid into the co-pilot's seat as if he had been born there, every movement efficient, deliberate, and purposeful. In that instant, the humility that had defined him in the cabin vanished, replaced by an unyielding focus and authority. He felt the weight of responsibility settle across his shoulders, heavy but familiar, like the first time he had taken the controls of a small aircraft under his instructor's watchful eye. Captain Miller's head jerked toward him, a flicker of relief and disbelief crossing his lined face. "Thank God," he rasped, his voice hoarse from tension. "The autopilot is disengaged and we're losing hydraulic pressure in engine 1. His hands, shaking slightly, pointed toward the instruments, and his eyes, wide with fear, sought reassurance. Jonathan offered none verbally. His eyes communicated certainty, precision, and control. His hands flew across the dashboard, fingers dancing over switches, knobs, and the yoke with a practiced ease that belied the intensity of the situation. The surge of adrenaline coursed through him, sharp and thrilling, yet he funneled it into methodical, precise movements. Each adjustment, each command sent to air traffic control was deliberate, a measured conversation between man and machine. "Tower, this is Flight 482. We have a partial hydraulic failure on Engine 1, requesting immediate vector assistance. I'm assuming control," he said, his voice calm, unwavering, a lighthouse in the storm of chaos surrounding them. Every second felt like a lifetime. Outside the cockpit, the plane pitched and yawned under the turbulent gusts. In first class, the violent shaking threw Cherry's champagne glass onto her lap, drenching the silk of her designer dress in a cascade of cold, effervescent liquid. She screamed, shrill and high-pitched, calling out to the flight attendants with a sharp insistence, "Tell that man to stop shaking the plane. This is insane. Do something." Her voice carried desperation tinged with entitlement, unaware that the turbulence was not a whim, but the raw expression of forces she could not control. Around her, passengers clutched their seats, faces pale, eyes wide with fear, but her own terror seemed filtered through the lens of indignation rather than recognition of the danger. Back in the cockpit, Jonathan noted the increasing instability. Every instrument blinked with urgent red alerts, every warning bell a frantic heartbeat. He adjusted the yoke, countering the violent pulls of wind and the quivering aircraft. The co-pilot remained unconscious, and Captain Miller's distress grew with every shudder. The older man's chest heaved as he struggled to maintain consciousness, and the sheer effort of fighting both the plane and his own body was etched in the tension across his face. Jonathan recognized the familiar signs immediately. He had seen too many people crumble under pressure to misread the cues. The captain's heart raced, his skin clammy. And Jonathan could see the silent calculation of mortality reflected in his eyes. Then, a deafening explosion shook the left side of the plane, reverberating through the cabin and cockpit alike. The instrument panels shuddered violently, sending papers and manuals skittering across the floor. Jonathan's body tensed, his muscles coiled like springs, yet he remained a calm eye in the hurricane of chaos. Captain Miller's hand shot to his chest, gasping for air, his own heart betrayed by the immense stress. Jonathan's eyes flicked to him with a flash of concern, but he could not afford the luxury of panic. He reached over, steadying the controls, and spoke with unwavering authority. "Captain, I've got this. Focus on your breathing. You're safe now." In that suspended moment, Jonathan became both protector and conductor, orchestrating the survival of hundreds. The alarms and explosions, the chaos of failing hydraulics and tumbling turbulence, became a backdrop against which his calm precision shone. Every micro-adjustment, every measured decision, was a thread of safety woven into a tapestry of potential disaster. The weight of responsibility pressed on him, yet rather than bend, he transformed it into resolve, into clarity, into purpose. Meanwhile, Cherry continued to scream, the mixture of terror and outrage leaving her almost paralyzed. Each wave of turbulence splashed against her body, soaking her dress and hair with a sheen of fear-induced sweat. The cabin attendant struggled to calm other passengers, to restore some semblance of order. But Jonathan's presence, even unseen, became a silent anchor. She did not yet understand that the man she had ridiculed, the man she had tried to dismiss, whose very presence she had challenged, was now the singular reason they might survive. And Jonathan, aware of every tremor, every panic-stricken glance from the passengers, felt the familiar tension in his chest, the prickling heat of fear, yet he transformed it into control, into steadfastness, into life itself. Time became elastic. Seconds stretched into eternities, yet every command, every adjustment, every precise flick of a wrist became the measure of hope against overwhelming odds. The plane shuddered again, the explosion's echo fading, but the turbulence persisted, relentless and indiscriminate. Jonathan's mind was a calm lattice of focus, his hands steady, his eyes scanning, calculating, predicting. Each action was a testament to both his skill and his humanity, the delicate intersection where courage meets compassion. In the cabin, passengers slowly noticed the subtle shift in the energy around them. The panic remained, but there was also an emerging awareness that someone capable, someone extraordinary, was guiding them through the storm. Cherry's eyes met Jonathan's brief glance as he passed by in the cockpit doorway, and for a fleeting instant, her arrogance faltered, replaced by raw, unfiltered recognition of both her vulnerability and the strength of the man she had underestimated. The storm outside and within the cabin raged, yet amid it all, a quiet, profound human truth began to crystallize. Courage often appears in silence, and strength is most visible when it is least proclaimed. The cockpit was silent except for the ceaseless roar of the engines, punctuated by the frantic blinking of warning lights and the occasional shriek of a panel alarm. Jonathan's eyes, dark and steady, scanned the gauges and instruments, noting every irregularity, every flicker of potential danger. Captain Miller's hands had finally slackened, the tension in his knuckles fading as his body surrendered to the strain. The older man slumped sideways, unconscious, leaving Jonathan the sole conscious pilot aboard a damaged Boeing 777 high above the turbulent expanse of the Atlantic. The sudden, stark isolation hit him with the weight of a tidal wave. Hundreds of souls were behind him, trusting, vulnerable, reliant on the precise combination of his skill and calm judgment. Families with children, couples with fragile plans for a reunion. And yes, even Cherry, the woman who had ridiculed him so cruelly mere hours ago. A flicker of bitterness threatened to rise, but he swallowed it, letting the protective instinct that had defined him since boyhood take over. He drew in a deep, steadying breath, feeling the vibrations of the aircraft beneath him. "I've got you," he whispered softly, almost inaudibly, to the plane itself, to the hundreds of lives tethered to his decisions. It was a quiet vow, a promise forged in the intimacy of responsibility, the kind that only someone who had faced danger firsthand could understand. Every muscle in his body tensed, ready to respond, to compensate for the absence of the co-pilot and the incapacitated captain. His mind ran through every procedure, every possible scenario, every contingency he had drilled until reflex and instinct were one. Jonathan reached for the intercom, pressing the button with deliberate calm. His voice, steady and resolute, carried across the cabin, slicing through the fear with quiet authority. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your new captain speaking. We have a technical situation, but I am in control. Please remain seated." He let the words hang in the recycled air of the cabin, his tone composed, devoid of panic, yet imbued with the invisible reassurance of competence. The passengers shifted uneasily, their fear palpable. Yet there was a faint, almost imperceptible sense of relief in the acknowledgement of someone capable taking charge. In first class, Cherry's ears caught the voice. She turned sharply, her eyes narrowing as she looked toward the intercom speaker, her lips pressing into a tight line. Her gaze swept past the other passengers to an elderly woman seated next to her, her face pale and drawn with terror. Cherry's scorn surfaced immediately, masking the flicker of fear that threatened to undermine her arrogance. "That thug?" she scoffed, her voice laced with venom and disbelief, the words cruel and dismissive. "He's probably hijacking us. I knew I was right to worry." The older woman's trembling hand gripped her armrest, eyes wide, and Cherie's attempt at derision seemed hollow even to herself, a fragile shield over the rising awareness of the peril around them. Jonathan's mind raced, his fingers brushing over the controls in a series of fluid, practiced motions. He realized, with a stark clarity, that the survival of everyone aboard depended not only on his ability to fly the plane, but also on the execution of emergency checklists, monitoring instruments, and activating auxiliary systems that required simultaneous attention. His focus, sharp and unwavering, calculated a single truth. He could not do it alone. Not physically, not mentally. He needed a pair of hands, someone steady, alert, capable of following instructions without succumbing to fear. Someone awake, someone calm, someone willing. "Sarah!" he called, his voice cutting through the cockpit's tense atmosphere, crisp and commanding, yet tempered by an undercurrent of reassurance. "I need a volunteer, someone who isn't panic-stricken, someone from first class who is awake. They will assist with checklists and controls under my direction." His eyes flicked to the array of instruments, the flickering lights, the plane's subtle yet relentless shuddering. There was no time for hesitation, no room for doubt. Every second could tip the balance between survival and catastrophe. Sarah, the head flight attendant, stood frozen for a heartbeat, her expression betraying both fear and indecision. Her hands clasped nervously, her body tense with the responsibility of selecting the right person. The cabin's muffled cries, the sound of rattling trays and unsecured belongings, punctuated the silence. Finally, her voice trembled as she spoke, hesitant yet unavoidable. The only one not crying was the woman in 1A Cherry. Her eyes darted to Jonathan for confirmation, the weight of the request almost unbearable. She knew Cherry's temperament, her arrogance, her history of entitlement and disdain, yet she had no choice. There was no one else ready. No one else present who could stand against fear and focus long enough to assist in this life-or-death moment. Jonathan's lips pressed together, and a faint, almost imperceptible smile flickered across his face. It was not amusement, but recognition. A recognition of the irony, of the challenge, of the strange poetry of circumstance. The woman who had scorned him, insulted him, had forced him to absorb humiliation silently, was now the only person who could help preserve hundreds of lives, herself included. He considered the delicate balance of human frailty and courage, the intersection where fear became service, arrogance met accountability, and weakness was transformed into unexpected strength. In the cabin, Cherry shifted uncomfortably, a flicker of apprehension crossing her carefully maintained composure. Her hands tightened around her armrests, knuckles white against the fine leather. She glanced at the terrified passengers around her and, for the first time, saw herself reflected in a mirror of vulnerability, not privilege. The contrast was stark, disorienting, humbling. Her world, usually so meticulously curated, now felt inconsequential, fragile, and terrifyingly small. Jonathan's gaze softened, though it remained firm and commanding. He was aware of her fear, aware of the inner resistance she would bring, yet he could also see the latent potential for focus, for obedience, for survival. "Sarah," he added, his voice gentle but resolute, "bring her here. She will assist. She has no choice, but she must act. Lives depend on it." The words were a quiet challenge and a lifeline simultaneously, demanding responsibility while offering the opportunity to rise above panic, to transform fear into action. As Sarah hesitated, the plane shuddered again, a reminder of the fragility surrounding them. Jonathan's eyes flicked to the blinking instruments, to the silent, unconscious captain, to the co-pilot who would never recover consciousness for the rest of the flight. The Atlantic stretched endlessly below, dark and indifferent, and the storm outside mirrored the turbulence within the cabin. Yet amid the chaos, a fragile human connection began to form, not born of friendship or trust, but of necessity, courage, and the faint, trembling spark of hope that even the most unlikely ally could rise to meet the impossible. Cherry, oblivious to the depth of her own transformation in that moment, followed Sarah reluctantly toward the cockpit. Every step felt heavy, each movement a confrontation with her own arrogance and fear. And Jonathan, seated among alarms, wind, and the relentless machinery of survival, braced himself to guide her, to rely on her, to witness the fragile bloom of responsibility emerging where vanity and entitlement had once flourished unchecked. In that suspended space between life and catastrophe, the foundations of redemption, human resilience, and quiet heroism were already being laid. Jonathan smirked, not out of spite, not out of triumph, but with the quiet, tired resignation of someone who had finally witnessed poetic symmetry unfold in real time. "Bring her in," he said, his voice steady, clipped, almost eerily calm. It wasn't revenge. There was no pleasure in it. If anything, the decision felt like a burden he wished didn't need to be made. But fate had drawn the lines, and now Cherry would have to face the consequences of her own noise, her own posture, her own fear. Sarah took a breath, nodding reluctantly. Outside the cockpit, the cabin shook with another round of turbulence that rattled cups, teeth, and nerves. People cried quietly into sleeves or whispered prayers into trembling hands. Cherry, however, impeccably groomed, furious at the loss of control over her existence, was the only one still arguing about champagne, seat cushions, and proper service. Her voice, sharp as broken glass, cut through the air long before Sarah reached her row. And then Sarah appeared again, gripping Cherry's forearm with an urgency that made the socialite stumble in her designer heels. "Let go of me." "I said let go. You can't just drag people around like—" But Sarah didn't release her. She guided, pushed, and practically delivered Cherry through the narrow aisle, ignoring the woman's sputtering outrage. Cherry protested every step, confronted with the uncomfortable truth that she was no longer in control of this narrative, or anything at all. When the cockpit door opened, Cherry froze. There he was, Jonathan, sitting in the pilot's seat, hands on the controls, focused, collected, radiating a quiet strength that contradicted every stereotype she had thrown at him just hours earlier. For a moment, Cherry didn't breathe. Her eyes widened with a mixture of horror and disbelief. "You?" she screamed, her voice cracking. "You can't fly this. I want the real captain. Someone qualified. Someone who belongs here." Jonathan didn't flinch, didn't turn, didn't even honor her outburst with a full glance. His eyes remained fixed on the flickering instrument panel, fingers adjusting dials with the grace of someone who had spent years mastering a craft nobody had thought to associate with him when they first saw him board the plane. His voice, when he finally spoke, was a blade dipped in ice. "Sit down, put on the headset, or prepare to die. Your choice, ma'am." The silence that followed felt like a physical force. Cherry's mouth hung open, stunned into stillness. It wasn't the threat that frightened her, though it landed with terrifying clarity. It was the tone. This wasn't the soft-spoken, humiliated man she had insulted in first class. This wasn't someone intimidated by wealth or beauty or the brittle social power she wielded like armor. This was a leader. A captain, a man carrying hundreds of lives on his shoulders, and she suddenly felt the smallness of her own world. Her indignation evaporated under the weight of the moment. Trembling, she eased into the jump seat. Her hands shook as she fumbled with the straps, the headset, the buckles she had never imagined she would have to touch. Her breathing hitched as she looked around the cockpit for the real captain she had demanded, and saw Captain Miller slumped over, unconscious, pale, barely breathing. Her eyes darted back to Jonathan. For the first time, the truth pierced the fragile bubble of superiority she had lived in. He was the only one left, the only one between life and the cold, merciless ocean below. She swallowed hard, her throat dry, makeup streaked by tears she could no longer pretend she wasn't shedding. Jonathan didn't give her time to collapse into panic. "Read this gauge," he commanded, pointing to the fuel pressure indicator. His voice was firm, but not cruel direct, urgent, grounded. "Tell me the number. Now." Cherry blinked rapidly, trying to force her eyes to focus. The numbers swam. The lights blurred. Her hands shook as she reached out instinctively and then pulled them back, afraid even to touch something. I can't," she whispered, the confession caught somewhere between shame and honest terror. Jonathan exhaled sharply and finally turned toward her. His gaze locked into hers, not angry, not mocking, but painfully honest, as if he were holding up a mirror she had spent her life avoiding. "You had a lot to say back there," he said, voice low, steady. "You were loud, confident, sure of yourself. Use that voice now. Help me save these people. Read the number." The words cracked something inside her. For a moment, she wasn't the perfect socialite or the untouchable woman who curated her life into flawless frames. She wasn't someone who barked orders or demanded compliance. She was simply human, scared, vulnerable, and suddenly aware of how fragile she truly was. Her breath trembled and she wiped her face with the back of her hand. The plane jolted again, a violent shudder that reminded her they were suspended in a metal shell with wings that were no longer trustworthy. Cherry leaned forward. She forced her eyes to focus on the gauge. 160, she stuttered. "I think. No. Wait. Yes. 160. Good," Jonathan said, turning back to the controls. "You did fine." It was a simple acknowledgement. But to Cherry, it felt like a lifeline, like someone seeing her not for her name or money or mistakes, but for effort, however imperfect. A tiny spark of something unfamiliar flickered in her chest. Maybe relief, maybe humility, maybe the first fragile seed of change. "Stay with me," Jonathan added, calm but commanding. "We're going to get through this. But I can't do it without you." Cherry swallowed again, nodding quietly. For the first time in her life, she listened. For the next hour, the cockpit became a crucible in which fear, desperation, and determination melded into a singular, tense rhythm. Jonathan's hands never left the controls, moving with precision and intent, fingers dancing across the yoke and instrument panel as if he were in conversation with the plane itself. Every gauge, every switch, every light demanded attention, and he orchestrated them all with the steady authority of someone who had spent countless hours learning not just the mechanics, but the poetry of flight. Beside him, Cherry's presence was a constant, humming reminder of the fragility of human pride. He had thrust her into this new reality not as punishment, but as necessity, and perhaps as a test of character she did not yet understand. Cherry moved hesitantly at first, the faint tremor in her hands betraying the delicate tension within her. Each checklist she read, each light she monitored, each minor adjustment she made under Jonathan's meticulous instructions was both terrifying and transformative. She wiped the sweat from his brow when his hands were too busy to do it himself, the gesture awkward yet genuine, an unspoken acknowledgement of dependence. Her perfectly manicured fingers left streaks of moisture, small but undeniable marks of her humanity, and for the first time, she felt the weight of the lives in the cabin beyond her own. The power dynamic shifted in real time. The woman who had entered the plane wrapped in arrogance, entitlement, and a thin veneer of social superiority was now subordinate to the man she had belittled. Every glance she stole at him betrayed awe and a creeping respect. Jonathan's skill, intelligence, and calm bravery in the face of life-threatening chaos illuminated the stark contrast between appearance and reality, between vanity and substance. Each decision he made was deliberate and precise, grounded in knowledge and compassion. And Cherry could not help but recognize the depth of his competence. Her previous judgments, her prejudices, dissolved in the face of raw human capability. Time became both endless and compressed. Minutes stretched into eternities as Jonathan guided the plane through the turbulent expanse of the Atlantic, calling for adjustments, monitoring fuel pressure, ensuring altitude, and managing the unresponsive Captain Miller. Cherry followed every instruction, her voice quivering with both fear and concentration. She read numbers aloud, double-checked lights, and recorded checklist items with growing accuracy. Every small success bolstered her confidence, though her body remained tight with the tension of near catastrophe. She began to understand, in a visceral way, what courage meant, what it required. Then, in a rare moment of temporary calm, the storm outside stilling just enough for the instruments to settle, Cherry's armor shattered. Her posture slumped, shoulders drooping as if the entire weight of her carefully curated identity had been stripped from her. Her face, pale and streaked with sweat and tears, bore the raw traces of vulnerability. She let out a tremulous sigh and whispered almost to herself, "I'm sorry." The words hung in the air, uneven and raw, lacking the polish of sincerity, but heavy with the desperation of a life suddenly stripped to its essentials. Jonathan glanced at her, his expression unreadable, a calm mask concealing the evaluation of both her soul and her intentions. I need to get to London," Cherry continued, voice cracking under the pressure. "If I don't sign these divorce papers by tomorrow, I lose my settlement. I'm broke, Jonathan. I'm a fraud. I have nothing but this image." The confession tumbled out in fragmented, breathless bursts, revealing the hollowness that had always been hidden behind designer clothes, sculpted smiles, and social gatherings. Her eyes glistened with the raw fear of mortality and the fragile terror of financial ruin, a far cry from the vanity and arrogance she had displayed just hours earlier. Jonathan listened, his hands steady, his gaze fixed somewhere just beyond the panel before him, absorbing each word, each quiver in her voice, each human flaw laid bare. He felt a quiet pity for the hollowness she revealed, not for the racism she had exhibited, nor for the cruelty of her arrogance, but for the desperation of someone who had invested everything in appearances and, at the brink of disaster, realized that it all amounted to emptiness. He understood her fear, yes, but his moral compass remained unyielding. Injustice, hatred, and prejudice could not be absolved by mere confession or circumstance. "Focus on the altimeter, Cherry," he said finally, his voice calm, deceptively simple, devoid of judgment but charged with necessity. Every word carried authority, every syllable tethered her to action, to survival, to the responsibilities she could no longer evade. He didn't need to lecture, didn't need to scold. The cockpit itself became the crucible in which her character was reshaped by circumstance. Silently, Jonathan flipped a switch on the overhead panel, activating the cockpit voice recorder. Every word, every confession, every trembling admission was now captured, a record of both truth and consequence. He did not look at her as he did this. His focus remained absolute, unbroken, yet the subtle click of the recorder symbolized a quiet justice, a mechanism through which dishonesty and pretense would be exposed without the need for personal vindictiveness. Cherry's hands trembled as she resumed her tasks, the voice recorder running unnoticed to her. Each motion, once trivial or mocked, now carried gravity. She checked lights, called out readings, and followed Jonathan's commands with a meticulousness born of both fear and recognition of what depended on her. She had become both servant and witness to a truth larger than herself. The human heart, fragile and flawed, had suddenly found purpose in responsibility. A subtle transformation occurred in her. Arrogance gave way to concentration. Panic softened into disciplined obedience. The socialite who had wielded her privilege like armor now operated as a vital cog in the survival of hundreds. And Jonathan, ever patient, ever resolute, guided her not with condescension, but with the steady precision of someone who understood that courage, even when belated, must be nurtured and directed. In that crucible, Cherry glimpsed the reality of her own limitations, and simultaneously, the power of human resilience and accountability. Fear had transformed into action, self-interest into service, vanity into humility. Each step, each reading, each number called aloud reinforced a connection between two people who had begun the journey as adversaries, but were now bound by circumstance, responsibility, and the unspoken recognition of life's fragility. By the time the turbulence began to subside, Cherry's voice had steadied. The tears on her cheeks remained, streaks of humility and terror alike, but beneath them was the faint spark of understanding that life, skill, courage, and truth could not be bought or demanded. They could only be earned, even in the unlikeliest of circumstances. Jonathan, for his part, continued to pilot the damaged aircraft with calm authority, silently witnessing the fragile emergence of honesty and accountability in the woman he had once endured as an antagonist. In the cockpit, amid the flickering lights and blaring alarms, a quiet human drama unfolded, one of confession, transformation, and the tentative emergence of hope. A sudden red warning light flickered insistently above the cockpit panel, stark against the dull hum of the cabin. Jonathan's eyes immediately scanned the instruments, narrowing in on the landing gear indicator. The left gear light remained stubbornly red, a glaring testament to malfunction. His heart, though steady in outward appearance, clenched at the enormity of the problem. Without the landing gear locked in place, any attempt to touch down at Heathrow would be catastrophic. Hundreds of lives, passengers, crew, and yes, even Cherry rested on the precision of a single, dangerous maneuver. Jonathan tried the automatic cycle, toggling switches with practiced fingers, expecting the systems to respond in their predictable patterns. Nothing. The machinery was stubborn. The red light remained, blinking mockingly, as if to underscore the fragility of human plans against the harsh, unyielding laws of physics. He exhaled slowly, suppressing the flare of panic he had seen so many succumb to over the years. There was no room for fear, only action, only clarity. Turning his gaze toward Cherry, he observed her frozen posture. Her face, pale and streaked with sweat, eyes wide with terror, mirrored the depth of the abyss that hovered beneath them. She had been transformed by circumstance into an unlikely ally, yet she remained painfully aware of her fragility, her inexperience, and the thinness of the barrier between life and catastrophe. Her hands clenched the edge of the jump seat as if it were the only tether holding her to reality. "We have a problem," Jonathan said, his voice calm yet imbued with absolute authority. "The landing gear is jammed. We cannot rely on the automatic system. We have to do a gravity drop." He paused, letting the words settle, watching her reaction closely. "I'm going to dive the plane and pull up sharply. The force should knock the wheels down. It's the only option." Cherry's scream pierced the cockpit, a raw, visceral sound of fear and disbelief. "You're going to kill us! You're insane! You can't— This is suicide!" Her voice cracked, her breath uneven. She tried to wring the words into something authoritative, something commanding, but it came out as panic, a reflection of her complete helplessness in the face of forces far beyond her control. Jonathan turned slightly, his dark eyes locking onto hers. The intensity of his gaze softened, just enough to convey reassurance without sacrificing authority. "Trust me," he said, his voice low and calm, almost tender. "I won't let anything happen to you, even you." The addition of those words, a subtle acknowledgement of her past arrogance and cruelty, was not a chastisement, but a reassurance, a bridge to her fragile trust. The edge in his tone was gone, replaced by the warmth of someone who saw beyond fear to the potential for courage in the human heart. He adjusted his grip on the yoke, feeling the weight of the plane in his hands, the immense pressure of controlling an 800-ton vehicle plummeting toward the ocean at hundreds of miles per hour. The engines roared louder, a deep, resonant cry of power that reverberated through the fuselage. Jonathan pushed the nose down. The plane responded instantly, a living machine obeying the hand of a master. Gravity pinned him, pinned Cherry, pinned every passenger to their seats, and the sense of helplessness in the cabin intensified. Cherry's knuckles turned white as she clutched the edge of her seat, the rush of air against the fuselage vibrating through her entire body. The ocean surged beneath them, an endless expanse of dark water that seemed to mock human plans, indifferent to lives dangling above it. Cherry's eyes widened further as the horizon tilted, waves shimmering like molten metal under the afternoon sun. Her mind raced, the memory of her petty grievances, of her arrogance, of her disdain for Jonathan, flashing before her with the stark clarity only imminent danger could provide. Every insult, every contemptuous word she had spoken in first class felt hollow, empty, inconsequential against the vast, terrifying reality of their situation. Jonathan's hands were steady, his breathing controlled, his focus absolute. The descent was calculated, measured in precise increments, every adjustment of the yoke a negotiation with physics itself. He felt the tremors of the plane, the subtle shifts of weight as air pressure changed. As the machine obeyed and resisted, as gravity and momentum battled against his skill. Cherry watched the controls, not fully understanding the intricacies, but sensing the confidence, the unshakable calm in the man she had once derided. "Hold on," Jonathan said, his voice cutting through the roar of engines and wind. He added nothing more, trusting the gravity of his presence, the authority of action, and the subtle reassurance of tone to guide her through the terror. Cherry's body shook, her entire being taut with anticipation. But a tiny ember of trust had begun to take root, fragile yet real. The plane dipped sharply, the sudden acceleration forcing both of them into the seats. Cherry gasped, her heart pounding in tandem with the metal heart of the aircraft. The water below rushed faster, a blur of deep blue and white foam, and she felt a flicker of something unexpected. Clarity. In that terrifying moment, she glimpsed the emptiness of her prior fears, the futility of her hatred, the hollowness of her social posturing. Life, she realized, was not about wealth, status, or control, It was about action, courage, and human connection. Jonathan pulled up, carefully modulating the yoke, the plane screaming in protest, wings flexing under the strain. The landing gear are stubborn and obstinate, finally succumbed to the force of physics, dropping into place with a satisfying mechanical click. Cherry's eyes filled with tears, not of relief alone, but of recognition, of humility, of the fragile gift of understanding how small her past fears had truly been. She exhaled shakily, the first genuine breath of surrender she had taken in hours. Jonathan's hands steadied the plane, eyes scanning the instruments, maintaining focus, but there was a faint, imperceptible smile tugging at the corner of his lips. The first obstacle of their survival had been overcome, not by brute force, nor by arrogance, but by courage, trust, and the transformation of fear into decisive action. For Cherry, seated beside him, the terror had left a subtle imprint, a seed of humility, a whisper of insight that perhaps life demanded more than privilege, more than contempt, and that survival depended on courage, on human connection, on trusting those who truly know how to lead. She had glimpsed her own emptiness, and in the reflection of Jonathan's unwavering composure, she began, faintly and painfully, to understand what it meant to truly respect and rely upon another human being. In that suspended moment between ocean and sky, fear and trust, death and survival, the two of them became a fragile, unspoken partnership, bound by circumstance and tempered by the extraordinary challenge of confronting mortality together. It was not triumph yet, but it was a beginning, a quiet, emotional awakening amidst the roar of engines, the shriek of wind, and the heartbeat of the Atlantic below. Jonathan kept his eyes glued to the blinking red light, refusing to accept what it meant, even as the truth pressed harder against the walls of his composure. The gravity drop should have worked. It always worked. The violent dive, the upward pull, the jolt, those forces were usually enough to shake loose even the most stubborn landing gear. But the light was still there, pulsing like a stubborn heartbeat. Red, 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 red. A soft curse slipped past Jonathan's lips, not loud, not angry, but the kind of quiet exhale that carried the weight of fear he didn't have the luxury to show. Outside the cockpit windows, the ocean had receded, but the sky carried streaks of storm, jagged swaths of gray pressing against the horizon like fate closing in. Every second in the air was a countdown. Cherry flinched at the curse, her breath caught, her face tightening in fresh panic. She clung to the sides of the jump seat as though the metal arms alone could save her from the terror swirling through her chest. She had begun to trust him, however reluctantly, but trust did not erase fear, nor undo the years of living in a world where she believed money and reputation could shield her from consequence. None of that mattered now. Here, in the narrow space of the cockpit, the universe reduced itself to bare-bones truths: skill, courage, and survival. Jonathan exhaled once, a measured breath, then reached down and ripped open a narrow maintenance manual from under the console. The turbulence rattled the plane violently, alarms blaring like a chorus of mechanical panic. He flipped through the pages with rapid precision, scanning for emergency protocols. Something caught his eye: a diagram, a location marker, a manual override. His pulse quickened. "Come on," he muttered, almost pleading with the machine. "Give me something I can work with." He found the notes an archaic, rarely used safety backup, a manual hand crank hidden beneath a floor panel, a tool from an older era of aviation, one that demanded brute force more than engineering finesse. He dropped the booklet and reached down, ripping open the floor panel beside his seat. A gust of cold, metallic-smelling air rushed out, carrying the scent of machine oil and years of dust. Cherry recoiled, nose wrinkling in disgust. "What is that?" Jonathan didn't look at her. He pulled the crank handle upward with a grunt, revealing a heavy steel lever attached to old gears. He stared at it for half a second before the realization struck him like a blow. "I can't fly and crank at the same time," he yelled over the alarms, the strain in his voice leaving no space for doubt. "Cherry, you have to do it." Cherry blinked, staring at him as if he had spoken in another language. "Me? Me? No, that's not... I can't." She swallowed hard. "I'll break my nails. And look at it. It's filthy." Her voice pitched upward into something shrill, and behind her panic was the old reflex, the one that defined her life. Avoid discomfort, avoid mess, avoid anything that threatened the illusion of perfection she built like armor. Jonathan slammed his palm down on the instrument panel, not out of rage, but urgency. His self-control finally cracked, revealing the intensity he had kept buried under calm professionalism. "Cherry," he snapped, the sound sharp enough to slice through the shriek of alarms. He turned, eyes blazing with raw truth. "There are 200 people back there. 200 human lives depending on that crank. Get on the floor and turn it, or their deaths will be on your hands." The words did not echo, but they landed with crushing weight. Cherry froze. Something inside her buckled. Her breath hitched, her mind fracturing under the enormity of responsibility. She looked at Jonathan, not the man she had insulted, not the stranger in first class, but the person holding the lives of every soul aboard with steady hands and impossible courage. Something in her chest cracked. The remaining pieces of entitlement she clung to so desperately simply shattered. Tears pooled in her eyes, spilling over as she slid off the jump seat, collapsing onto her knees. The cockpit floor was cold, grimy, smeared with oil and dust. Her designer dress brushed against the metal, the fabric catching, tearing slightly. She didn't even flinch. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the crank handle. It was heavier than she expected. Solid iron, stiff from lack of use. Her first attempt barely moved it at all. She let out a strangled gasp, already sweating, her hair clinging to her forehead. "I can't." "You can," Jonathan said, not turning away from the controls, but softening just enough for those two words to land inside her like a small gift of hope. "You can. And you must." Cherry gritted her teeth. Her breath came in short bursts. She wrapped both hands around the handle, bracing her knees against the floor, and pulled. The crank resisted with brutal, grinding force. Her hands shook violently, her nails bending painfully. She let out a cry as one nail split, jagged and bloody at the edge. Another cracked moments later. The pain shot up her fingers, but she didn't stop. This was not the pain she was used to, the kind of pain she performed, exaggerated for attention or sympathy. This pain was raw, grounding, real. She pulled again, and again. Every turn of the crank felt like wrestling with the weight of her entire life, her fears, her lies, her carefully curated facade. Sweat dripped down her temples, darkening the fabric under her arms. Her dress clung to her back. Her breath came in ragged, desperate gulps, but she did not stop. Above her, Jonathan fought the crosswinds. The plane lurched violently, the pressure slamming both of them sideways. Cherry slipped, her elbow hitting the floor, pain spiraling through her. She whimpered, but pushed herself upright and gripped the handle once more. The gears groaned, the sound deep and aching as though the plane itself were crying out in strain. She pulled harder, her arms shaking uncontrollably. Her hair stuck to her face, her mascara smudging down her cheeks in thick black streaks. She looked nothing like the immaculate woman who had strutted through first-class hours earlier. But in her disheveled, desperate struggle, something truer emerged. She was fighting. She was choosing to fight. Jonathan felt the shift beneath the plane as the gears began to move. A subtle vibration whispered through the cockpit floor. He risked a glance down. Cherry was still cranking, tears dripping off her chin, her body shaking from exhaustion. She met his eyes for a moment, and in hers he saw something raw. Fear, yes, but also determination. And something dangerously close to courage. "Keep going," he murmured, voice steady with a quiet, fierce encouragement. "You're doing it." For the first time, Cherry believed him. For the first time, she believed in herself. She tightened her grip, ignoring the throbbing pain in her fingers, and cranked again, this time with a guttural sound of effort that came from somewhere deep inside her. The handle turned another inch, then another. The gears moaned louder. Jonathan felt the landing gear shift one more fraction of a position. They weren't safe yet, not even close, but they were no longer standing still. Cherry's tears fell freely, but she didn't stop. In those raw, humiliating, grueling minutes on the cockpit floor, she shed more than her broken nails and ruined dress. She shed the illusions, the armor, the pretense. She was breaking, but in the breaking, she was beginning, ever so faintly, to rebuild. Jonathan felt the subtle vibration through the cockpit floor as the landing gear settled into place. The faint click reverberated like a heartbeat through the cabin, a small mechanical sound loaded with monumental significance. Cherry's body sagged with exhaustion, her hands trembling as she slumped onto the floor. Her face was streaked with tears, her hair plastered to her forehead, her dress smeared with grime and sweat. Yet in the rawness of her exhaustion, there was a spark, a fragile, glimmering trace of accomplishment. 3 more turns, Jonathan shouted, voice taut but steady. He kept his eyes on the runway, lights emerging through the thick London fog. Each beacon seemed to him like a promise of life, a fragile thread he must follow with absolute precision. He could feel the weight of the plane in every muscle, every sinew, the roar of the engines reverberating through his chest. The passengers behind him, families, children, strangers were in his hands, and he would not fail them. Not now, not ever. Cherry, though drained to the point of near collapse, glanced up at him. His focus was absolute, unyielding, yet beneath it lay a calm that reached her through the haze of fear. He wasn't just commanding the aircraft, he was commanding her trust. She tightened her fists around the edge of the floor panel, summoning the last reserves of strength and resolve. With a final, guttural scream that rose from deep in her chest, she cranked the heavy lever, feeling the gears grind and shift beneath her hands. Thud, click. 3 green lights flashed across the panel. Cherry gasped, a mix of relief, disbelief, and the dizzying aftermath of effort washing over her. She had done it. Against every instinct, every ounce of her carefully constructed life, she had performed a feat she never imagined possible. In that moment, humiliation gave way to awe, exhaustion to quiet triumph, and terror to a fragile, tentative pride. Jonathan exhaled, the muscles in his jaw flexing as he turned his attention back to the yoke. The plane was still coming in fast, faster than ideal, and the fog blurred his visual cues, demanding absolute precision. His arms burned from the strain, every motion calculated, deliberate, yet fluid, a perfect balance of tension and control. Every second was stretched thin, each heartbeat a drumbeat echoing in the cavern of responsibility that now encompassed him entirely. "Brace for impact!" he bellowed over the intercom. The cabin shook with the command, passengers gripping seats and straps with white-knuckled fear. The words carried authority and honesty. There was no embellishment, no attempt to soothe with empty reassurance. This was truth, terrifying, immediate. Cherry scrambled back to her jump seat, her body slick with sweat, tears still streaking her cheeks, and she watched him with awe. The man she had once derided, feared, and dismissed now embodied everything a human could aspire to be. Calm in chaos, skilled beyond measure, and selfless in the face of mortal danger. The runway emerged from the fog like a long, gleaming promise, stretching into the distance with an almost surreal clarity. Jonathan lined up the plane meticulously, Every minor adjustment a conversation between him, the aircraft, and the uncertain air around them. He felt the weight of momentum, the subtle resistance of wind, and the delicate balance between too steep and too shallow an approach. The engines roared, the tires, still in the air, waiting for contact, thrummed with potential energy. The first touch came abruptly, the tires screeching against tarmac as if protesting the violence of their meeting. The aircraft bounced, the suspension groaning, the frame shuddering dangerously close to the grass bordering the runway. Sparks flew from the undercarriage where the metal scraped against small irregularities in the pavement. Passengers gasped collectively, holding on to one another. Eyes wide with fear, yet none dared move, frozen by the gravity of survival and the skill before them. Jonathan fought the controls with every fiber of his being, muscles burning, sweat dripping down his temples. Yet his mind remained razor-sharp. He countered the bounce, corrected the alignment, and gradually, agonizingly, slowly, brought the plane into compliance. Inch by inch, he wrestled it onto the runway, each movement precise, deliberate, and measured against the faintly trembling fog of risk that surrounded them. Cherry's gaze never left him. She had seen fear, panic, and human vanity in action in countless situations before. But this raw confrontation with mortality, skill, and grace under pressure was something entirely new. He wasn't just a pilot. He was a savior, a quiet hero whose strength lay not in arrogance, but in competence, compassion, and the unyielding refusal to surrender to fear. She felt her own ego dissolve, replaced by an unanticipated reverence, an understanding that true power is quiet, steady, and accountable to something larger than oneself. The plane's nose finally leveled as it skidded along the tarmac, sparks trailing, engines whining in protest, wings flexing with every adjustment. Jonathan felt the last tremors, the vibrations running up through the floor into his seat, and gave a measured push on the yoke, aligning perfectly with the runway centerline. Slowly, achingly, the plane began to settle, tires gripping more securely. The final moments were tense beyond measure, a balancing act between gravity, momentum, and his own physical limits. He allowed himself a single tiny sigh as the aircraft shuddered to a halt. Silence followed, a profound, echoing silence. The alarm still hummed faintly, the engines idled with a subdued growl, and every soul aboard the plane held their breath in collective awe. Cherry remained frozen in her seat for a heartbeat longer, the magnitude of what had transpired pressing down on her chest. Her tears had dried in places, leaving streaked trails on her cheeks. Yet her hands remained clenched, trembling with a mixture of fear, relief, and admiration. She looked at Jonathan, and in that gaze was unspoken acknowledgement, respect, and the first tentative spark of gratitude. She had seen him save lives, and she had participated painfully, humbly in that salvation. Jonathan exhaled again, longer this time, feeling the tension drain from his shoulders just enough to notice the plane, still alive beneath him, still carrying its precious cargo. He allowed a fleeting private smile, a quiet celebration not of personal glory, but of survival, of resilience, and of the fragile human courage that had emerged in the most unlikely of circumstances. In the cockpit, silence reigned, not the absence of sound, but a presence, heavy with awe, understanding, and the transformative power of shared ordeal. In that moment, Cherry understood the emptiness of her previous fears and the vastness of human capability. And Jonathan, ever steady, ever quiet, allowed himself a single thought. The storm may pass, but courage, once awakened, never fades. The moment the plane's tires screeched to a halt and the engines finally began to idle, a wave of relief surged through the cabin. The passengers, stunned and breathless just seconds before, erupted in spontaneous, unrestrained cheers. Some clutched each other, tears streaming freely down their faces. Others shook their heads in disbelief, as though the sheer audacity of survival had rendered them speechless. The cacophony of gratitude and astonishment filled the cabin, echoing against the walls, bouncing from seat to seat, saturating the air with raw human emotion. Jonathan slumped back in his seat, allowing his muscles, still burning with exertion, a moment to relax. Sweat trickled down his forehead, dampened strands of hair clinging to his temples, his uniform sticking to his back. He exhaled, deep and measured, and allowed a small, private smile to grace his lips. The plane was still alive beneath him. The people he had fought so fiercely to protect were alive, unharmed, their lives extended by the precision, skill, and courage he had summoned in the storm above the Atlantic. He felt a quiet pride, not in ego, but in purpose fulfilled, in duty executed to the fullest. Captain Miller stirred, a groan escaping his lips as he gradually became aware of his surroundings. His eyes fluttered open, groggy and disoriented, the events of the last hour crashing back on him in waves. Medics surged forward, assessing him with practiced urgency, their voices calm yet insistent, guiding him back to awareness while checking for signs of cardiac stress. Jonathan spared a brief glance toward him, noting the sweat-slick pallor, the tremor in his hands, and the vulnerability that had been hidden beneath the veneer of authority just minutes ago. Even the captain, seasoned and experienced, had been human, frail, and fallible. Cherry, meanwhile, began to move. Slowly, deliberately, she unbuckled her seatbelt, the fabric tearing softly in places where the ordeal had already claimed its toll. Her eyes roamed the cabin for the first time, taking in the chaos, the relief, the exhausted smiles of strangers who had just survived an extraordinary ordeal. And then her gaze settled on herself. Her ruined dress, torn and smeared with grime. Her hands, nails jagged and broken from the effort of cranking the landing gear. Her face streaked with sweat and mascara. In that moment, the immediate fear, the sharp, pure terror that had gripped her during the flight, evaporated like mist under the sun. It left a vacuum, and into that empty space rushed something else, something familiar, something she had cultivated for years: entitlement. She straightened, smoothing her hair as best she could, dusting off the grime with a small, exaggerated flourish. Her eyes found Jonathan, still wiping the sweat from his brow, his uniform disheveled but immaculate in purpose. She let out a sharp, measured exhale, the first sign of the mask she had carefully maintained all her life: arrogance, disdain, and self-assured superiority. "Well," she huffed, her voice attempting casual lightness, but carrying an unmistakable edge, "you did your job. But don't expect a tip, you ruined my dress." She gestured vaguely toward the remnants of her gown, as if the damage it had sustained could somehow measure the scale of the ordeal. Her hand went instinctively to her purse, and with a precise flourish, she drew out her phone. "I'm going to sue this airline for emotional distress," she declared loudly. Her words designed to carry across the cockpit, to carry authority, to assert control. "And I'm going to tell them the pilot forced me to do manual labor." Her lips pressed into a thin line, her expression carefully neutral yet tinged with calculated indignation. She was returning to herself, the socialite she had been, the woman who believed rules applied to others but not to her. Jonathan's eyes met hers, a brief, pointed glance that conveyed everything words could not. There was disappointment there, yes, a deep, almost aching acknowledgement of her choices, but not rage, not anger. He did not rise to her provocation. He did not flinch, nor did he attempt to argue. He simply exhaled and, with a quiet, controlled gesture, pointed to the overhead panel. The subtle movement was laden with meaning. The cockpit voice recorder was still running. Every word of her desperate, self-serving confession, every admission about hiding assets, avoiding obligations, and manipulating appearances had been captured. Cherry's eyes flickered just slightly, a shadow of realization crossing her carefully maintained mask. but only for a fraction of a second. Her mouth pressed into a tighter line, her expression adopting the polished neutrality of someone well-trained in social performance. It was clear. The mask had slipped, briefly revealing her humanity, her fear, and her raw vulnerability. But now, in the safety of survival, she could resume her practiced role. She might recognize the peril she had narrowly escaped, but she would do so privately. Outwardly, she returned to her self-fashioned identity, as carefully curated as any designer gown she had ever worn. Jonathan exhaled once more, slower this time, letting the tension in his shoulders ease slightly. He watched the emergency crews surround the plane, the flashing lights of ambulances and fire trucks illuminating the runway in stark, urgent clarity. Paramedics moved efficiently through the cabin, checking passengers, guiding the shaken and the injured to safety. The once humiliated, now trembling, and entirely human Cherry stayed in her seat, her mask in place, her entitlement quietly resurgent, but Jonathan understood it all. He understood human frailty, fear, and the endless capacity for both self-delusion and awakening. He didn't need to argue, to correct, to chastise. He had already done the work that mattered. He had saved lives, upheld justice, and revealed truths not with rage, but with steady skill, courage, and unwavering morality. In the quiet aftermath, there was a profound contrast. Some would return to their illusions, their habits, their social performances. Others, even if for a fleeting moment, would carry forward a deeper recognition of what it meant to survive, to witness heroism, and to see one's own humanity reflected in the courage of another. Cherry looked at him one last time, her eyes flickering with a mixture of admiration, fear, and defiance. Jonathan met the gaze briefly, a quiet acknowledgement passing between them. She would cling to her mask as she always did, but the truth of the cockpit, the raw, unvarnished reality of life, death, and courage, had left an indelible impression on her. Outside, the cabin continued to buzz with relief and awe. Emergency crews coordinated with precision, passengers embraced, whispered, cried, and laughed. The collective exhale of 200 souls filling the air. Inside the cockpit, Jonathan allowed himself the merest hint of a smile. He had done his duty. He had saved them all. And in that, for now, he could rest, not in triumph, not in vindication, but in the quiet, enduring fulfillment of purpose. The roar of the emergency crews outside was deafening, a chaotic symphony of sirens, shouts, and the metallic clatter of equipment. Yet inside the cockpit, the air was thick with a charged stillness. Jonathan's shoulders were heavy with exhaustion, but his posture remained poised, calm, and commanding. The ordeal of the flight had left its mark on every fiber of his being, yet he bore it lightly, with the quiet dignity that comes from a man who has faced death and refused to let it define him. The cockpit door swung open abruptly. A pair of police officers stepped in, their uniforms crisp, their presence commanding immediate attention. They didn't glance at the disheveled passengers, the scattered manuals, or the evidence of the struggle. Their eyes were fixed forward, purposeful, moving with certainty toward the cockpit controls and the man who had orchestrated survival from chaos. Jonathan rose slightly in acknowledgement, a subtle nod of respect, as the lead officer's gaze met his. Cherry, ever aware of optics, straightened instantly. Her posture snapped into the familiar elegance she wore like armor, her voice crisp and controlled. "Officers, thank goodness. I want to report this pilot for endangering me," she declared, her words precise, her tone polished. The practiced performance of fear and indignation masked the raw terror and shame she had felt only moments before. She smoothed the front of her dress with a delicate hand, a gesture meant to convey composure, control, and propriety. But the lead officer barely acknowledged her. His attention remained fixed on Jonathan. "Captain, great flying," he said, voice calm but carrying the weight of official recognition. "We received a transmission from the tower. You had the mic keyed open during the descent?" Jonathan allowed a small, vindicated smile to cross his face, subtle but full of quiet triumph. "Yes," he admitted, his tone even, devoid of arrogance, but filled with the satisfaction of justice. "We had a radio malfunction. It seems the tower and the authorities heard everything in the cockpit for the last hour." His eyes, steady and unflinching, flicked toward Cherry. The words landed on her like shards of glass. Her face went pale, the carefully constructed mask she had relied on for years slipping momentarily under the weight of revelation. The crimson flush of panic crept across her cheeks as she realized, with a sinking, visceral certainty, that the private, desperate confessions she had spoken into the CV are the admissions of bankruptcy fraud. The hidden assets, the lies she had carried into her divorce proceedings, had been captured in their entirety. There was no hiding, no manipulation of circumstance, no room for the social performance that had defined her identity for so long. The officer's voice cut through the tense silence, measured and decisive. "Ma'am, we need to check your bag, and you're under arrest for attempted fraud and customs violations." The words hung in the air, final and unyielding, and the weight of consequence settled on Cherry's shoulders. Her lips parted in shock, a startled gasp escaping her, but she did not resist. There was a flicker of fear, yes, but also the first faint recognition that her carefully curated life had collided head-on with reality, and there was no room left for illusions. Handcuffs clicked around her wrists, a metallic echo that seemed to reverberate through the cockpit. She turned her head as she was guided toward the exit, eyes locking with Jonathan's one final time. There was a storm of emotion in that gaze. Disbelief, anger, humiliation, and an unspoken acknowledgement of the man who had bested her without hatred, without malice, yet with unassailable skill and integrity. In that brief exchange, Jonathan saw the spectrum of human fragility laid bare: fear, arrogance, vulnerability, and ultimately, the undeniable force of truth. Jonathan remained standing, tall, his figure calm against the backdrop of flashing lights and frantic movement. He picked up his pilot's cap, straightened it on his head, and exhaled a long, steadying breath. Every muscle ached, every nerve throbbed with exhaustion, yet his demeanor radiated quiet victory. As he walked past Cherry, who was still struggling with the shock of the arrest, he leaned slightly and spoke softly, with measured kindness that belied the extraordinary tension of the moment. "Have a safe flight, ma'am." His words were simple, but in them lay the profound truth of his character: grace under pressure, integrity without self-interest, and the capacity to rise above hate to serve humanity. The cabin was alive with energy as Jonathan stepped into the aisle. Passengers who had moments before clung to each other in terror now rose to their feet, some with tears, some with unsteady smiles, all united in collective awe. A standing ovation erupted spontaneously, heartfelt and unrestrained. Hands clapped, voices cheered, some passengers whispered words of gratitude, their eyes wet with the lingering residue of fear transformed into relief. In that moment, Jonathan was not just a pilot. He was a savior, a quiet hero whose courage, skill, and moral clarity had preserved life, dignity, and order in the midst of unimaginable chaos. The cheers carried through the fuselage, washing over Jonathan like a wave of acknowledgement, respect, and silent admiration. It was not the applause of fame-seeking crowds or empty recognition. It was the raw, authentic gratitude of those whose lives he had touched irrevocably, whose hearts he had calmed in the storm, whose humanity he had honored in the most perilous of circumstances. As he reached the rear of the plane, he allowed himself a final glance back toward the cockpit. The wreckage of pride and the remnants of entitlement remained, a stark contrast to the quiet, enduring triumph of courage and justice. And in that moment, he realized something profound. True heroism was not about accolades or recognition. It was about rising to the challenge, protecting the vulnerable, and embodying the best of humanity when it mattered most. Jonathan turned toward the exit, every step a testament to endurance, resilience, and quiet triumph. Outside, the world continued, but within the fuselage of the plane, a story had been written that would never be forgotten, a story of courage, redemption, justice, and the irrefutable truth that character, not wealth or status, defines the measure of a person. If you were inspired by Jonathan's courage and the incredible story of survival, resilience, and justice, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more real-life stories that uplift, inspire, and remind us all of the power of humanity at its best.